Jason Van Weenen is an ecologist with Green Adelaide. We're here to talk about the ibis. How are you going, Jason?
Very good, thank you.
Now, I know your focus is in the metropolitan area. We broadcast into the northern suburbs of Adelaide, but more generally, we are seeing more and more in our metropolitan areas these ibises that are, sometimes they're affectionately referred to as bin chickens. I mean, is that part of the adaptation we're seeing?
So what we're trying to do with this project is over the last 20 years or so, we've seen a really noticeable increase in Adelaide. So obviously they sort of seem to be building up in the region, which is a bit new for us. And so what we're hoping to do is learn a bit about what's driving some of the changes we're seeing, and certainly understanding what things they're getting into in terms of food resources is something which will be an important part of the project.
And I guess in terms of their distribution, what was, traditionally, hard to trace in some ways, but where did the ibis generally tend to inhabit, before our metropolitan areas got bigger?
Yeah, so they obviously they use a lot of wetland areas and pasture grassland sort of areas where they use their beak for probing for insect larvae in the grass under the soil. So they've got really good tools to getting those grubs out of the ground. But in the metropolitan landscape, we see them doing a bit of the same, where they're out on ovals, getting grubs out of ovals and things like that. But it's some of the other other areas they're accessing for food is what we're hoping to learn a bit more about in Adelaide. But certainly those natural wetlands are a sort of an area they focus on a bit, and even artificial wetlands throughout the metropolitan area tend to be a bit of a focus for the birds.
Yeah, and it's conceivable, isn't it, that we might see these birds even in some of our regional, major centres, or if not even in towns. If they're getting into the habit of hanging around metropolitan area of Adelaide, they might find their way into other communities as well, if they're not already.
Yeah, for sure. So that they are very adaptable. Obviously, they being able to eke out a living in metropolitan places birds generally have to be pretty adaptable in lots of ways, and so because there's lots of challenges through those modified landscapes for the birds, but they've obviously shown a good ability to adapt. They've sort of been had a real strong presence in Eastern Australia, a lot of those metropolitan areas around Eastern Australia for a long time, and we're certainly seeing that adaptation to those centres, urban centres in SA now.
And I'm familiar, for instance, from seeing them on the Gold Coast of Queensland in all of the parks, and they get quite tame. They come quite close to where you might be having a picnic or what have you. Is that the same ibis? Is it a different species in the south, or are we seeing the same one across the eastern seaboard now into Adelaide?
Yeah, so it's the same species. So it's the Australian white ibis, and that is the same birds. Yeah, that presence all up the east coast is something that lots of people have taken for granted for a long time. But yeah, in South Australia and particularly in Adelaide, we're really seeing that the birds take off in the metropolitan area over the last decade in particular, but they've sort of the data shows that increase over probably a 20-year period.
Now, I gather you're looking to get some data with the help of the community to get a sense of what the population numbers are of the bird and what they're doing.
Yeah, so we're hoping to do a bit of a tagging project, and that's putting tags on the wings of birds, which has sort of been This work's been done in Eastern Australia, and we're trying to replicate some of that here. But what we're really keen is for the community to report the sightings of tagged birds. So what it means is that we can look at how they're moving across the landscape in general, and so we can tag birds from different locations. So we've got various breeding colonies around Adelaide, and we can by tagging birds in one location, we can see how far they're venturing across the city, and that help of the community to let us know where the birds are is a really fundamental part of that project. So particularly those tagged birds, if people see them there, we've got encouraging people to report those sightings via a Big City Bird app. That would be fantastic. And we also hope to do a bit of satellite tracking work of birds in the metropolitan landscape to get that real fine scale movement. So we'll have some general stuff of a reasonable number of birds through the wing tagging work, but we'll hopefully also add to that with some fine-scale satellite tracking work of some individuals.
And when it comes to, I guess, looking further ahead, if this expansion and inhabitation in metropolitan areas or even regional centres occurs, is it a case of we learn to live with the animal, or what measures are being taken in other states, for instance, as they learn to live with increased ibis populations in major centres?
Yeah, so I guess that's part of this project, is to try and understand what the birds are doing, where they're going, and also what's driving some of the changes here in South Australia. So by actually having a closer look, a fine-scale look at what the birds are doing across the landscape, it might help us better understand, okay, if we want to, if we're seeing this trend, or if we've got concerns, what's actually making up an ibis's day in South Australia, in Adelaide, and how could you change things so some areas are more favourable for ibis, while other areas are maybe less favourable, to help reduce conflict. So that's a big part of this project.
Yeah, I noticed I think it's in the eastern seaboard somewhere, in some parts of Sydney, I think, they have what they call cockatoo locks on rubbish bins to stop them getting into bins. I'm not saying necessarily the ibis is getting into those, but is it possible we might end up coming up with technologies of ways to encourage the ibis to, I guess, go to its usual natural habitat and maybe not be seeking food in man-made environments?
For sure. So that's sort of, if we've got concerns about them in particular locations, but in lots of ways it could be that we're effectively feeding them in locations. And so if we're feeding them at a spot, well then, if we're not happy with them being in that location, restricting access to that food is probably a sensible way to go. So having that information, understanding what resources they're using, if they're getting into bins or if they're hanging around cafes or whatever it is that they're doing, which is actually providing them with a food resource, well then having a closer look at that and trying to understand how to change behaviours in those areas or restrict access to food if the birds aren't welcome in a particular site, and in trying to enhance those sites that we want them to be in, or that the people are keen to have them. And so that's will be hopefully a good outcome of this project.
Green Adelaide ecologist Jason Van Weenen is with us. Just lastly, Jason, what's the name of that app again? If people see a tagged bird, where do they report that, where they've seen it?
Yeah, so it's the Big City Birds app. So log on to that and take a photo of those wing tag birds, and then you can upload them directly into that. For more information, we've got a bit of information on that app on the Green Adelaide website, so hopefully you'll find something there as well if you're keen to track down the app.
Thanks a lot again, Jacob. Much appreciated your time with us today here on Flow FM.
No worries, thank you.